When love turns toxic, the day my wife betrayed me. Mark adjusted his tie in a mirror, smoothing the fabric against his chest. The soft morning light filtered through the blinds, casting sharp slashes of gold across the bedroom. Everything in this space was curated. Julia's touch was everywhere. The perfectly aligned picture frames, the color-coordinated bookshelves, the scent of lavender from the essential oil diffuser. It was suffocating. "Are you seriously wearing that tie?" Julia's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. Mark turned, finding her perched on the edge of the bed, legs crossed, her phone in hand. She didn't look up. "What's wrong with it?" he asked, already dreading the answer. She let out a sigh, the kind that made him feel like a child who had just disappointed his mother. "You wore it to last month's dinner. It looks tired." Mark looked down at the navy blue silk. It was fine, more than fine, but arguing wasn't worth it. Not today. He turned back to the mirror, yanked off the tie, and reached for another. "That one's better," Julia said before he even had it fully around his neck. Of course it was. He said nothing as he finished getting dressed. Silence was easier. Silence kept the peace. By the time he reached the kitchen, the smell of coffee filled the air, rich and familiar. He reached for a mug, but before he could pour, Julia's voice came again. "Can you at least put your dish in the sink when you're done this time?" Mark froze midpool. "I always do," he said carefully. Julia let out a dry laugh. "Oh, really? Because I could have sworn I had to clean up your mess yesterday. And the day before that." It was nothing, a minor request, but something inside him coiled tight. "I think you're exaggerating," he muttered, setting the coffee pot down. Julia's expression sharpened as she leaned against the counter, arms crossing. "Excuse me?" Mark turned to her, jaw tight. "I said I think you're exaggerating." A beat of silence. The air thickened. Then Julia laughed, shaking her head. "You're being ridiculous." Mark stared at her. The doorbell rang, cutting him off. Saved by the bell. Julia brushed past him, her perfume trailing behind her. "That'll be Ashley. Try not to embarrass me, will you?" The comment barely registered. Mark exhaled slowly, fingers pressing into the countertop. He wasn't sure when things had started feeling like this, like he was always teetering on the edge of an argument, like his words never quite belonged to him. Maybe it had been gradual, a slow erosion rather than an explosion. But as he took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness spread across his tongue. It hadn't always been this way, had it? Mark stood in the kitchen, his fingers gripping the edge of the marble counter. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the space, though it did little to ease the tightness in his chest. Across from him, Julia paced with sharp, clipped movements, her silk robe swaying as she turned on her heel. "You didn't come home last night," she said, her voice dangerously smooth. Mark exhaled through his nose. "I told you I needed space." Julia scoffed, tossing her dark hair over her shoulder. "Space? What does that even mean, Mark? You disappeared. No calls, no texts. Do you have any idea how that made me feel?" How it made her feel. It was always about her. Mark clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settle in his stomach. But this time, something inside him resisted. "You threw coffee at me, Julia." His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "You humiliated me in public. And instead of apologizing, you're making this about you?" Julia's eyes flashed. "Oh, come on. It wasn't that serious. You're acting like I assaulted you." Mark inhaled sharply, his grip on the counter tightening. "You threw something at me. That's not normal, Julia. That's not okay." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Julia's expression shifted, her lips curving into a bitter smile. "You know what's really not okay, Mark?" she said, voice laced with venom. "The fact that my husband would rather run to Ryan than face our problems like an adult." Mark felt his stomach twist. Here it was, the shift, the turning of the tables. He had seen it before, lived through it countless times. Julia had a way of bending reality, warping it until he was the villain in his own story. He had spent years believing her. "Ryan was there for me," he said, his voice quieter now. He actually listened. He didn't make me feel crazy. Julia let out a sharp laugh. Oh, please. Ryan hates me. He's been trying to turn you against me for years. And now, congratulations, you finally let him win. Mark shook his head, running a hand through his hair. This isn't about Ryan. It's about us and how toxic we've become. Julia took a step forward, her expression softening in an instant. Baby, she murmured, reaching for his hand. We just need to communicate better. Every couple fights, but you don't walk away over one bad night. Mark stared at her, his pulse pounding in his ears. One bad night? Was it just one? Or had they been unraveling for years? Julia's fingers brushed against his wrist, but this time he pulled away. Her face darkened. Mark, she warned. I need to go to work, he said, turning toward the door. Mark! He kept walking. And as the door clicked shut behind him, for the first time, he wondered if he'd ever walk back through it again. The streetlights flickered as Mark pulled up in front of Ryan's apartment complex, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart was still pounding from the argument. No, the explosion that had driven him here. His shirt was still damp from the coffee Julia had thrown at him, the fabric clinging to his skin like a reminder of everything he had endured. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the cracked pavement below, the hum of the engine filling the silence. How had he gotten here? How had things unraveled so completely? The thought lingered as he finally exhaled and stepped out of the car. The cool night air wrapped around him, carrying the distant sounds of the city, honking horns, muffled voices, the occasional burst of laughter from people whose lives weren't falling apart. Mark climbed the stairs two at a time, his pulse quickening as he knocked on Ryan's door. It took only a few seconds before the door swung open, revealing his best friend in a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, a beer in one hand. Ryan's eyes immediately scanned Mark's disheveled appearance, landing on the dark stains spreading across his chest. His brows furrowed. Jesus, man. He stepped aside, motioning for Mark to come in. What the hell happened? Mark let out a humorless laugh, running a hand through his already messy hair. Coffee, he muttered, thrown at me. By Julia. Ryan shut the door behind him. Of course it was. The apartment smelled like old takeout and something vaguely citrusy, maybe the remnants of an air freshener Ryan had forgotten to replace. It was messy but lived in, a stark contrast to the pristine, museum-like quality of the home Mark shared with Julia. He sat down on the couch, sinking into the worn cushions with a heavy sigh. Ryan plopped down across from him, setting his beer on the coffee table. All right, he said, leaning forward. Talk to me. Mark hesitated. He wasn't sure where to start. The truth was, it wasn't just about the coffee. It wasn't even just about tonight. It was about years of this. Years of walking on eggshells, of apologizing for things he hadn't done, of slowly losing pieces of himself just to keep the peace. He let out a slow breath. I think I've finally had enough. Ryan's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something between relief and frustration. About damn time. Mark shot him a half-hearted glare, but Ryan didn't back down. I've been watching you put up with her shit for years, Ryan said, his voice calm but firm. You disappear, man. You used to be fun. You used to have a life outside of her. Then one day, it was like you weren't even you anymore. And now, she's throwing shit at you? And you're just now realizing this isn't okay. Mark swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that love was complicated, that relationships took work. But the words felt hollow. Because deep down, he knew Ryan was right. Mark exhaled. I always told myself marriage is hard. That if I just tried harder, she'd be happy. That if I could just. Marriage is hard, Ryan interrupted. Abuse isn't. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Mark blinked. Abuse. Ryan leaned forward. Yes, abuse. Dude, this isn't normal. She isolates you, manipulates you, makes you feel like everything is your fault. And now, she's getting physical. What's next? A plate instead of coffee? A slap instead of words? Mark's stomach twisted. He wanted to deny it, wanted to tell Ryan he was overreacting. But the truth clawed its way up his throat, undeniable and suffocating. He thought back to the way Julia's eyes had burned with rage when she had thrown that coffee. The way she had looked at him, not with anger, but with control. Like she knew she had power over him. Like she expected him to stay, no matter what. Mark's hands curled into fists. "I need to go back," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I need to get my things. Tell her it's over." Ryan studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You sure you can handle that alone?" Mark forced a smirk, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "What? You want to hold my hand?" Ryan smirked back, but the concern in his eyes didn't fade. "I mean, I'd record it for evidence, at least." Mark huffed out a laugh, shaking his head. But the humor didn't last. Because deep down, he wasn't sure how Julia would react. And that terrified him. Mark woke up to the scent of stale beer and takeout, his back aching from Ryan's lumpy couch. Sunlight leaked through the blinds, drawing pale stripes across the coffee table, cluttered with empty bottles and a half-eaten box of pizza. For a moment, before his mind fully caught up, he felt a strange sense of peace. No tension in his chest, no invisible weight pressing down on him. Just the quiet hum of the city outside and the sound of Ryan snoring in the other room. Then reality came crashing back. Julia. The argument. The coffee. The way she had looked at him. Like he was nothing. Like he was an inconvenience. Like he was a thing she owned that had just malfunctioned. Mark exhaled and sat up, running a hand down his face. His phone sat on the couch armrest beside him, the screen dark. He hesitated before picking it up. 16 missed calls. He didn't even have to check to know they were all from Julia. A part of him wanted to listen to the voicemails to see if she sounded remorseful, if she was crying, if she would say she was sorry. But a deeper, quieter part of him already knew the pattern. First, anger. Where the hell are you? Then guilt tripping. After everything I've done for you? Then desperation. Please, Mark, I love you. He had seen it play out before, over and over. But for the first time, he wasn't rushing to fix it. He wasn't scrambling for a way to smooth things over, to shrink himself just enough to fit into the version of Mark she wanted. For the first time, he wasn't going home. The thought sent a strange, unfamiliar relief through him. A door creaked open, and Ryan shuffled into the living room, scratching his head. He squinted at Mark. "Damn, you look like you just had an epiphany or something," he muttered, flopping into an armchair. Mark let out a dry chuckle. "I think I did." Ryan raised an eyebrow, waiting. Mark leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. "I've spent years convincing myself that Julia just has a strong personality, that I'm the one who needs to adjust, to keep the peace, to make things work." He exhaled. "But I don't think this is just a rough patch. I think this is who she is." Ryan didn't say anything for a second. Then he nodded. "Yeah, I've been waiting for you to figure that out." Mark turned his head, frowning. "You never said anything." Ryan shrugged. "You wouldn't have listened. You had to get there yourself." Mark wanted to argue, but he couldn't, because Ryan was right. He had defended Julia so many times. When his friends said she was controlling. When his mother had hesitated at their engagement. When his gut, his own damn gut, had whispered that this wasn't love. He had ignored them all, because it was easier to believe that love was supposed to be hard. Ryan stood up, stretching. "You want coffee?" Mark huffed a laugh. "As long as you don't throw it at me." Ryan smirked. "No promises." As he walked into the kitchen, Mark reached for his phone again. He stared at Julia's name on the screen. For years, he had always been the one to break first, to apologize, to smooth things over, to make himself small so she could feel big. But not this time. This time, he wasn't calling back. Mark's hands were steady on the door handle, but his heartbeat betrayed him. It pounded against his ribs, a rapid, uneasy rhythm that echoed the weight of the moment. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled. This was it. No turning back. He pushed open the door. The familiar scent of vanilla candles and expensive perfume clung to the air, But tonight, it felt suffocating. The house was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of fingernails against a phone screen. Julia sat on the couch, her perfectly manicured fingers scrolling mindlessly, legs curled under her like she had no care in the world. She didn't look up immediately, but when she did, her expression flickered. First irritation, then something dangerously close to amusement. "Well," she said, locking her phone, "look who finally decided to come home." Mark set his keys on the table. "I came to get my things." Julia blinked. The playful lilt in her voice vanished, replaced by an icy edge. "Excuse me?" Mark exhaled, steadying himself. "I'm leaving, Julia." A pause, a slow, deliberate blink. Then a laugh, sharp and hollow. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she said, standing up. "You had a tantrum and ran to Ryan's like a child. Now you're back. So let's just—" "I'm not back." Something in his tone stopped her mid-sentence. Her jaw tensed. Mark held his ground. "I'm done." For a moment, silence settled between them. Julia's breathing quickened. She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly, as if he had just insulted her intelligence. "Oh," she said. "So that's it? You're just walking out? After everything I've done for you?" Mark clenched his fists. "Everything you've done?" His voice wavered, not with uncertainty, but with the sheer force of everything he had held back for years. "Julia, you don't love me. You love controlling me. You isolate me. You twist my words until I don't even know what I'm apologizing for anymore. You make me feel like I'm never enough, like I owe you every part of myself just to keep the peace. And when I finally stand up for myself, you throw things at me." Julia scoffed. "Oh, don't be dramatic. It was coffee." Mark let out a breathless laugh, one that held no humor, only disbelief. "It was control," he said, voice quieter now but somehow heavier. "And I'm done letting you have it." A muscle in Julia's jaw twitched. "You are so ungrateful," she spat. "I've given you everything. This house, this life, me. And this is how you repay me? You're seriously just throwing it all away?" Mark met her gaze, unflinching. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm finally choosing myself." Julia's breathing hitched, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her fury. "If you walk out that door," she hissed, voice low and venomous, "don't come back." Mark held her gaze for a long moment. Then, with a strange, overwhelming sense of peace, he nodded. "I wasn't planning to." He turned, grabbed the bag he had packed earlier, and walked toward the door. Behind him, he heard the sharp intake of breath, the split second before impact. Smash! Something shattered against the wall, just inches from where he had been standing. A coffee mug. Mark paused, not in fear, but in understanding. This was who she was. This was who she had always been. He just hadn't let himself see it before. Without another word, he opened the door. And as he stepped outside, the night air wrapping around him, he felt something he hadn't in years. Freedom. The first few days after leaving Julia felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between freedom and fear. Mark had expected relief. He had expected some sense of victory. But what he hadn't expected was the weight of silence. For years, his life had been dictated by her moods, her demands, her expectations. There was always a call to answer, a text to explain, a rule to follow. But now there was just nothing. It was eerie. The first night in his new apartment, he lay on a mattress without a bed frame, staring at the ceiling. His phone sat beside him, screen dark, except for the occasional buzz. "Julia, we need to talk." "Julia, Mark, this is insane. You can't just throw everything away over one argument." "Julia, you're being manipulated. Ryan's turning you against me." "Julia, come home. Let's fix this." Mark shut his eyes, but the words stayed burned into his mind. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't acknowledging what she had done. She was just twisting the story, making him the villain. Typical. The following days were a blur of packing up his things when Julia wasn't home, making quick trips to grab his clothes, his books, the small things that were actually his. Ryan came with him, standing by like a bodyguard, cracking jokes to keep things light. "This is the saddest collection of clothes I've ever seen," Ryan muttered, holding up one of Mark's plain button-downs. "Did Julia dress you in government-issued husband uniforms?" Mark snorted. "She didn't like bright colors." Ryan's face twisted. "Dude, no wonder your soul almost died." Mark chuckled, but there was an edge of truth to the joke. He had lost himself in that relationship. Every part of him had been molded to fit Julia's expectations. His clothes, his words, even the way he carried himself. Now he was reclaiming it, piece by piece. Then came the anger. Julia stopped texting. She started calling instead. When he didn't answer, the voicemails came. First, the sweet ones. "Mark, I know you need space. I know I messed up, but we've been together too long to just throw this away. Please just talk to me." Then the cutting ones. "You're a coward. Running away like this instead of being a man and working things out? Pathetic." And finally, the desperate ones. "I hope you know Ryan doesn't actually care about you. He's just using you to get back at me. He's always been jealous of what we had. You're too stupid to see it." Mark stared at the phone in his hand, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. For years, he would have believed her. For years, he would have caved. But now, he could finally see through her. She was unraveling, and not because she missed him, because she was losing control. One evening, as he unpacked the last of his things in his tiny new apartment, Ryan sat on the floor across from him, drinking a beer. The place was nothing like the house he had shared with Julia. It was small, kind of bare, and smelled faintly of new paint. But it was his. "Let me ask you something," Ryan said, swirling his beer. "If she actually said sorry, like genuinely apologized, would you go back?" Mark stared at the boxes stacked in the corner, thinking. The old version of him might have. The one who made excuses for her. The one who believed that love meant enduring pain. But now? "No," he said simply, "because she doesn't think she did anything wrong. And even if she did, I can't forget how it felt. How it always felt." Ryan nodded. "Good answer." Mark exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "It's weird, you know? I should feel free. I should feel happy." "You will," Ryan said. "Give it time." And maybe Ryan was right. Maybe healing wasn't instant. Maybe it came in layers, in small victories, in quiet realizations. Maybe it was something you had to fight for, piece by piece. But for the first time in years, Mark was ready to fight for himself. And that was enough. The cafe smelled like roasted espresso and vanilla, a scent that wrapped around Mark like a familiar embrace. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting golden streaks across the wooden tables. Outside, people walked briskly, their lives moving forward just like his. Mark sat across from Ryan, his hands wrapped around his steaming cup of coffee. The warmth seeped into his palms, grounding him in the moment. It had been 3 months since he left Julia. 3 months since he'd walked out of that house, shedding years of manipulation and control like a heavy coat he had forgotten he was wearing. Ryan took a sip of his drink, eyeing Mark over the rim of his cup. "Okay, real talk. When's the last time you smiled this much?" Mark let out a breath of laughter. It was a simple question, but it hit him in a way he hadn't expected. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window as he thought about it. "I don't even know," he admitted. And that was the truth. There had been good moments in his life before, sure, but there was always an undercurrent of tension, a quiet voice in the back of his mind reminding him to be careful, to avoid upsetting Julia, to walk the tightrope of their marriage without slipping. But now there was silence. Now there was peace. Ryan smirked. "Well, it's a good look on you." Mark shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. He felt lighter, like he had been carrying an unseen weight on his shoulders for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to stand tall. "I won't lie," Mark said, swirling his coffee absent-mindedly. "The first few weeks were rough. I kept waiting for the guilt to hit me, you know? Kept wondering if I'd made a mistake." And Ryan prompted. Mark exhaled, setting his cup down, and it never came. Instead, There had been clarity. The more time he spent away from Julia, the more he saw the ways she had twisted his reality. The fights that started over nothing. The way she always found a way to make him feel like the villain. The way he had shrunk himself, piece by piece, just to avoid conflict. But he wasn't that man anymore. "I've been sleeping better," Mark continued, running a hand through his hair. "Eating better. I go to the gym again. I actually like being home now, which is weird because I used to dread it." Ryan grinned. "So what you're saying is, leaving her was the best thing you ever did." Mark let the words settle between them. He took another sip of coffee, rolling the flavor over his tongue before nodding. "Yeah," he said, "it really was." And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just saying it. He believed it. Mark stepped out of the cafe, the crisp air brushing against his skin. He inhaled deeply, letting the coolness fill his lungs. Everything felt sharper, more real. His phone buzzed in his pocket. When he pulled it out, his stomach didn't drop. His pulse didn't spike. It wasn't Julia. It was an old friend, someone he had lost touch with over the years. Someone he was finally ready to reconnect with. He smiled, slipping the phone back into his pocket as he walked down the street. Life was moving forward, and for the first time in years, he was excited to see where it led.